We'd like to welcome our listeners today to the Middle Tennessee Cyber Conference. Today I've got Alissa Knight, and Miss Alissa Knight, she's a recovering hacker of 20 years, blending hacking with a unique style of written and visual content creation for challenging brands and market leaders in cybersecurity. Alissa is a cybersecurity influencer, content creator, community manager, as a partner at Knight Inc. that provides vendors go-to-market and content strategy for telling brand stories at scale in cybersecurity. Alissa is also the principal analyst in cybersecurity at Alissa Knight and Associates. Alissa is a published author through her publisher at Wiley, having published the first book on hacking connected cars, and recently received 2 new book contracts to publish her autobiography and a new book on hacking APIs. As a serial entrepreneur, Alissa has started and sold 2 cybersecurity companies to public companies in international markets, and also sits as the group CEO of Breyer and Thorne and managed security service provider. So Alissa,
thank you, Steve. I always feel bad for people when they have to give my bio, because they're like 20 minutes later they're like, okay, we're done, the show is over.
You're such a fluid person because you're involved with so many things, and we've got a couple of questions today. And the Middle Tennessee Cyber Conference is held usually in May every year, right in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and we'll have 300 to 500 attendees that represent the IT
that's amazing.
Industry. Yeah. And Alissa, we got a couple of questions because we've watched a lot of your podcast, and and your ability to hack APIs, and we're actually giving away 2 of these books during our Capture the Flag, and we're looking forward to your books this next year. So,
awesome. Thank you, Steve.
So here we go. While part of your many talents is looking into APIs and looking at the security of those pieces of code, are you seeing more APIs and apps that are coded sloppily?
Ooh, good question. Yes, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I never like to kind of run around saying the sky is falling and selling fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but it is getting a lot worse as I look into more APIs into different sectors. In 2019, I downloaded 30 financial services and fintech mobile apps and hacked those in a week, about 8 minutes per app. And then in 2020, I downloaded 30 mobile health and telehealth apps and hacked those in a week. And now in 2021, I'm focused on hacking what are called FHIR APIs. And that's a term in the healthcare sector that, as a result of the CARES Act and the ONC passing a rule around this, all healthcare providers and payers are now required to provide health patient data through these APIs for anyone requesting it, or they're in violation of the information blocking rule. Oh, wow. So, I don't. The problem is that all of the APIs that I've tested in my most recent research were vulnerable to broken object level authorization, or what are called BOLA vulnerabilities, where the API is properly authenticating Steve, but it's not authorizing your connection and saying Steve shouldn't be allowed to view Alissa's patient records. So they're properly authenticating you, but they're not authorizing you and saying only Steve can view Steve's PHI records. Right. So yeah, it is getting bad, and I'm afraid it's just going to continue to get worse as lawmakers come in and say, okay, we need to be doing this. Everything is moving to APIs. It's the entire plumbing system for the U.S. financial sector, for our financial infrastructure, our healthcare infrastructure, IoT. It's unfortunately not getting any better. Now, the other thing that you need to remember about with APIs is you may have an API that's totally secure and I can't hack, at least right now, but what about the API downstream that's pulling data from that a more secure API, and that data is getting stored in the API downstream that's less secure? Where, Steve, is the hacker going to target? They're going to target the easier, more vulnerable API. It's always going to be the weakest link in the chain.
We were just talking about that, and most people are going to think that APIs are secure because they have certificates and SSL, TLS, and when you're really looking at intercepting that with traffic interdiction, how are you doing that, or what's the best way to listeners who are not familiar? How are you intercepting it? Is it Burp Suite or other tools, or how are you fooling that certificate?
Yeah, so it's a great question as well. So this is what I call person in the middle attack, or woman in the middle attack, or man in the middle attack. But basically, what you're doing is you're interdicting that traffic. You're going in between the API client and the API endpoint, and what you're doing is you've got special software that sends a fake certificate to the client and a fake certificate to the server. So a great analogy is if I were going in between your conversation and someone else, and I introduce myself to you and pretend to be that other person, and then I introduce myself to the other person and say I'm Steve, right? And then you both think you're talking to each other, but you're not. You're talking to me, and that's kind of the way these man in the middle attack or woman in the middle attack tools work. Is they present a certificate in both directions, and when that happens, you're able to decrypt that traffic. So if it's SSL encrypted or TLS encrypted, that tool, because you're in the middle and you're presenting certificates to both directions, you're able to decrypt that traffic and then use that to take those API requests and, just like you mentioned, Steve, paste it into Burp Suite or paste it into Postman and send those API requests to the API endpoint and then manipulate it, right? At that point, I'm already in my API client. I don't have to rely on the mobile app. I don't have to rely on the web browser. I can just use my API client to manipulate and change those API requests to request someone else's record. So instead of requesting my patient record, I'm going to request your patient record or someone else's patient record. And so by virtue of being able to decrypt that traffic and look at it and see how the API works and what it's expecting, I can manipulate those API requests with my own tool.
Oh, outstanding. And just really curious with the utilities, utility-based companies, water, electric, they have to somewhere rely on APIs, with their SCADAs and PLCs and ICS systems. Now, have you worked with those or know of ongoing, not just research, the people who are really looking at it like yourself?
Yeah, so this is, and it's interesting you brought this up because I rarely talk about it. So when I sold my last company, Applied Watch, I went to go work for the U.S. intelligence community in cyber warfare. And after a while, I knew that the conflicts I was supporting two contracts in Afghanistan and Iraq for the counterinsurgency advisory and assistance teams contracts and the counter IED contract in Iraq. And I knew that those conflicts were going to wind down. I knew that, I really wanted to shift focus to going back to moving out of coin and going back to cyber. And so my first return back to cyber was, believe it or not, a nuclear power plant. So I actually created the program and implemented the cybersecurity program at San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station. And this was my first foray into hacking SCADA systems. And so I, went to training. I got certified as a certified SCADA security architect. And my job was to build up this team, build this capability, implement the security controls, build out the program in compliance with NERC SIP, and perform pen testing against these systems that were responsible for cooling this nuclear material. It was probably the scariest part of my career, while also the most exciting. Yeah, and I think I kind of know where you're going with that question. And the critical infrastructure for the United States, like everything, in a lot of countries is increasingly going from being disconnected to being connected and getting an IP address. And the things that were never previously connected, Steve, what does that mean if all of a sudden they're connected? Before, they didn't have to worry about cybersecurity because it wasn't connected. Now they're throwing an IP address on it and saying, okay, well, it's connected now, but what about the security around it?
Well, I tell you what, we learned something about you every single time, even during the live interview.
Because you're asking the right question, Steve.
That's, but anyway, here we go. You often go on stage.
Okay.
You often go on stage, and you come out and you say, "I'm here to scare the crap out of you." Now, which we have a lot of folks that do that, and it's eye opening for people. But especially along these APIs and apps, where we have passwords and we've got multi-factor authentication, patching, doing updates, all the endpoint, all that stuff. How do we bring attention to the fact that people really need to look at APIs and apps in that interconnected world? When we have our cell phones and we're throwing apps on everything, how do we bring attention to that?
So that's the thing, right?
That's a great job, by the way.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that's exactly what I was going to say. And to me, the best way that you can get companies, be the impetus for companies to do something about the problem and hold their feet to the fire is through vulnerability research like this and content like this and what I put out. A lot has changed over the last 2 decades. Originally, open disclosure, full disclosure might result in you getting a lawsuit or, being arrested. Now we've moved to this bug bounty system and companies participating in it, but it's still in its infancy. Companies are still trying to figure out their liabilities around it and whether or not they're okay with this and what brand damage does this mean if vulnerabilities are discovered as a result of this. But I think it's slowly starting to change. And the thing is that for the companies that don't want to change and don't want to fix those vulnerabilities, I think the type of content I publish, what I like to call affectionately adversarial content, is showing the efficacy of these security controls by hacking something. And now I don't know if you saw, I'm going to be keynoting at DEF CON and talking about my new research in hacking federal and state law enforcement vehicles. And this is the first time that it's actually coming out public. And so it's in the attacks that allow me to remotely take control of these vehicles are a result of vulnerabilities in the APIs. And so, I think the answer to your question is that scare factor, that scary the work to try and drive them to fix this and remediate this, I think is a very effective way is what I'm doing now. And so I am kind of the position of #more please, and trying to find more in the day to be able to do it, more time in the day.
And I would absolutely agree with that. It's through that educational process. It's the people like yourself and the other folks that go through codes and find those vulnerabilities or what have you.
And Steve, I do want to make one last point. Sorry to interrupt. I do want to say, I don't want corporate America or these companies or these different organizations, and like, for example, this was, as I'm sure you can imagine, incredibly controversial research. I ended up getting contacted by DHS, FBI, NSA, CIA. They all use this automaker, and and I won't say the name, but we all know who it is. And and I ended up presenting to all of the 3-letter agencies on these attacks. And but here's the thing. The original impetus to them reaching out to me, law enforcement reaching out to me to do this, it was sanctioned by law enforcement. And it was because the automaker wasn't willing to work with them to try and understand the attack surface. And this poses a safety concern to the life and safety of our law enforcement officers and their families. So to me, this was incredibly philanthropic research. I didn't charge law enforcement at all for the time. It was 2 years of my life. It was philanthropic research for me, and because I care about the life and safety of our law enforcement officers. And for the shock factor for me was was this automaker not willing to work with them because they didn't want them to know what data they were collecting off the vehicles. They didn't want, to really be involved in helping them understand this attack surface. And so for them to have to reach out to a vulnerability researcher was very shocking to me, because you would think they're law enforcement. They can compel anyone to act to do anything they want them to do. And I'm learning, I learned in this whole process that's not necessarily the case. There's a very adversarial relationship between corporate America and law enforcement, and them being able to for law enforcement to support its mission. And so I guess what I'm trying to say, Steve, is I don't want organizations to look at me in a very polarized adversarial way. I'm doing this to make products safer, doing this to make sure that there's colloquy and discourse around this, because it's very important, and it affects, like, it's one thing if a hacker defaces a website. It's another thing if a hacker hacks my car and my family is in it. So it's to me it's very near and dear to my heart.
And to be honest with you, and I know we're just right at the cusp of being out of time, I would completely agree. And it's when those individual vendors may not be taking action that it is important to have people like yourself to do those things, to bring it to light. And watching your podcast where you try to redact that information and protect them. But do you ever get vendor feedback? Because you go to a million conferences, especially the last couple of years, just like we do, and those vendors are right there with you. Do you find they're receptive and there's not a lot of pushback, or do vendors come up and say, hey?
So, I think the interaction with the automaker was, for the first time in my experience, was very, it definitely bordered on the line of adversarial. They obviously weren't too happy about this. It affects not just law enforcement vehicles, but affects every single car on the road, right? Because let's be honest, these automakers aren't making, a completely different back-end infrastructure just for law enforcement. It's the same infrastructure for regular civilians and law enforcement. So this obviously created a lot of work. And Steve, unfortunately, a lot of these vulnerabilities are still there. They haven't been fixed. It's a good question, and unfortunately, I wish I had a better answer. But I think it depends on the organization. A majority of the time, like, for example, in my healthcare research, the EMR companies are very appreciative of the work, and they're being very supportive. And they're like, hey, look, what can we do to help you? What do you need access to? I mean, basically, they're getting a free penetration test. Sure. An ethical hacker, is breaking their stuff for them and showing them how I did it, so they can make a better product. But then you run into the companies that are like, hey, what's the deal? Why did you do this? What are, so I think it depends. I'm hoping that the world begins to change, and that's the thing about we as humans, is we always evolve, and we always stop and think and say, you know what, maybe my position on this has been wrong all this time. Maybe I need to look at this differently. And that's what I love about, the human race, and what I love about us as people is we evolve. Right. And I'm hoping that the position on corporate America and the position with many of these companies does evolve with it, and starts to look at us as vulnerability researchers and hackers as a friend versus the enemy. And that's what I love about a lot of these initiatives, like hashtag this is what a hacker looks like, and showing pictures of us playing with our kids or being out with our families, and trying to change that narrative around what is a hacker. We're not these evil people with hoodies. Yes, I'm wearing a hoodie right now, but that's just ironic. we're all a part of the same team, and it's all about finding the vulnerabilities before the bad guys and the bad girls do, right? It's finding it first and then helping the company to make a more secure product in the process.
Alissa, we appreciate your time today. We know you got to go. You have a full schedule. Fantastic speaking with you, and
thank you,
hope
Steve.
to see you soon.